So last class we were talking about how we go about establishing that an ethical theory is a good ethical theory. And I laid out a number of criteria that a good ethical theory should adhere to. Number one, I said a theory should be consistent. Number two, I said that the theory should be plausible. Number three, I said that the theory needs to have explanatory power. And finally, I said that the theory should align with our shared core moral beliefs. This week I had you all do an exercise where you had to list a number of things that you thought were immoral and then rank those things according to how confident you were that these things are in fact wrong. And hopefully you are able to see that there is, despite all of our different upbringings, there's a fair amount of consensus amongst us regarding those things that are immoral and that they were really not that willing to budge on. And a couple of these things we said that seemed immoral are things like murder is wrong and rape is wrong. What we're going to do today is look and delve a little more deeply into this. And I want to begin by fleshing out a bit more some of these shared core moral beliefs that we have. Because if we're going to erect a moral theory, we need to have a fairly good understanding of our starting point. As I said, what we've revealed thus far is that some things appear to be wrong, murder and rape. I think there are probably a number of other things that we agree upon, and you may never have even thought about it because it seems so obvious to you. For instance, I imagine probably all of us believe that it is wrong to punish innocent people for crimes. I actually saw a story about a man who had spent 30 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And what's most tragic about this, well, there are a number of things that are tragic, but one thing that's tragic is the prosecutor knew, or at least highly suspected, that the man was innocent, but didn't care because he just wanted to make a name for himself. The story gets even sadder than that, though, because after he was released from prison, and it was determined that he hadn't committed the crime 30 years later because someone else confessed to it, he ended up dying of cancer within the few months after he was released. And this story just is so sad and tragic. I think all of us feel compassion for such a person, someone who's sentenced to jail for crime that they didn't commit. Furthermore, I imagine probably most of us think that the punishment should fit the crime, that it would be wrong to, for instance, send someone to prison for 20 years for a minor speeding infraction, or for someone to be caned with a pole for dropping a piece of litter on the ground. These things are going to become important later on, but hopefully you're willing to at least go with me for right now on this, that some things just seem wrong. Murder, rape, and then also we have views about punishment. And again, if a moral theory implies that the punishment doesn't need to fit the crime, or if a moral theory implies that it's perfectly permissible to punish innocent people, then it's so much the worse for that theory. Now, I'm not saying that innocent people don't sometimes get punished. I acknowledge that. I think we all are aware of that. But what I'm saying is that it seems inappropriate. It seems wrong. And especially if someone knows that the person is innocent, it would seem even more so to be wrong. Another belief that we have, I think, ordinarily about punishment is that some people can simply be mistaken in their moral beliefs. Sometimes you hear people say things like, well, it's all relative. Whatever you believe is fine by you, and I believe what's fine by me. But I don't think that that's something we really adhere to, not at the end of the day. We do sometimes just say, well, it's all relative, and you can have your moral beliefs, and I have my moral beliefs. But I think there are going to be certain kinds of restrictions to that. And for instance, if you were to meet a person who thought that child molestation was perfectly morally permissible, if he said, yeah, I think that molesting a small child is perfectly fine, I doubt seriously you would say, well, you're entitled to your beliefs, I don't believe that. I think rather you'd think, that person is messed up, or that person is immoral, that person is wrong. I think that we recognize intuitively that people can actually get their value system off. This is why, for instance, when we hear about people who, commit mass murder, we don't say, well, he's entitled to his belief to kill innocent people. Rather, we say, that guy's a sicko, that guy's a scumbag, that guy's a degenerate. When we find out about parents who've neglected their children, we don't say, well, that's just, their belief. They don't think they should have to feed their kid or clothe them. Rather, we say, that's wrong. They should do those things. So this is the second point I wanted to highlight, is that people can, in fact, and we do recognize people can be mistaken in their moral beliefs. One final thing I want to point out here, and this is something that you may never have really considered, but I imagine that a lot of us believe that there is such a thing as moral progress. Now, I want to be very, very careful in what I say here, because I'm not trying to suggest that things are perfect in the world now. Far from it. Things are really bad for a lot of people. There's a long ways that we need to go as a society and as a race, as a group of people at all. But nonetheless, I think if we look back over time, we can see that some things have changed and that they've changed for the better. So think back, about 150 years ago, we allowed in this country one person to own another as property, and they were treated as less than human. That's illegal now. You're no longer allowed to do that. And I think a good question to ask yourself is, does that seem like a step in the right direction to abolish slavery? That's a change? Is it a change that's truly for the better? And I think most people are going to say yes. Granted, some people are going to be, hold different opinions, and there's not too much you can do about them. But on the whole, I think most everybody's going to recognize, yes, the abolition of slavery, that's a change, and it's a change for the better. It's a step in the right direction. Back during the 1960s, there were a number of laws passed in this country that afforded more civil rights to minorities and women. And I think most people would agree that those kinds of changes were not just simply just mere changes, but they were changes for the better. They were a step in the right direction. And this is what I'm referring to when I talk about moral progress. It's just that society can change and that it can change for the better. Now, I acknowledge sometimes society does change for the worse, but that would just be, again, an example of digression. It would be an example of going backwards. And the important point here is just that when society changes, it's not just mere change. It's not completely neutral. Changes can be for the better, and they could be for the worse. When change is for the better, I think we instinctively recognize that that's good. That's true progress. And when things changes for the worse, we say, hey, we've really regressed here. We've gone back. This is not good. We don't just say, well, things are just different. If, for instance, people's civil rights were taken away, we wouldn't say, well, things are just different now. We'd say, no, that's regress. That's going backwards. That's not good. And so these are 3 points I want to highlight about our ordinary, or what I suspect to be some common beliefs we have amongst our ordinary moral system that we all adopt. Number one, there are some particular things we can point to that are wrong. Number two, we recognize that some people can be mistaken, that not anything goes when it comes to morality. And at number three, people can make, or we as a society can make general progress, and even individuals can make real, genuine progress. Now, if you agree with what I've just said, then unbeknownst to you, you've adopted a view that's known as moral realism. This is something that you've probably never heard of before, but it is a theory in morality. And what it says, quite simply, is that there are some objective moral truths. Now, that's a very brief definition, and it's really going to require some unpacking. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by focusing on the word objective. And I'm going to try to give you a characterization of what an objective truth is in order that you can better understand the definition of moral realism, the belief that there are some objective moral truths. So just bear with me right now, and I'm going to take a brief digression into the nature of truth itself. Now, when we discuss some things being true, there are two broad categories in which we can describe things as being true. On the one hand, there's what we consider something to be an objective truth. Sometimes people call this absolute truth. Sometimes people call it a universal truth. But basically, if something is objectively or universally true, that means that it's true, and it's true not because of anything that we happen to believe, think, or desire. The truth is in no way dependent on humans. We don't simply invent these kinds of truths, rather they are out in the world waiting for us to discover them. And there are a number of different kinds of objective truths, but some clear examples that most everybody will agree are objective truths are things like historical facts. For instance, the Civil War ended in 1865. That's a fact. If you believe that the Civil War ended in 1965, you're simply wrong. Your belief does not line up with the facts as they are. Then there are scientific facts as well. Objects on Earth fall at 9.8 meters per second. If you think objects on Earth fall at 30 meters per second, then you're just simply wrong. You don't understand the facts. Then there are also facts of mathematics and facts of logic. And these are things that are true. They're universally true. Even if someone doesn't agree with them, that person is just simply wrong. Even if you had a whole society that thought differently. Suppose, for instance, you had a whole group of people, you had a whole country that thought the earth was flat. Well, then they wouldn't be right. They would just all be wrong about the shape of the earth. And so when we talk about objective truths, what we're referring to are things that are true independently of any particular facts about human belief, thought, or desire. Now we contrast objective truth with what we call relative truths. And relative truths, these types of truths are true in virtue of what people believe, desire, or think. And there are two different kinds of relative truths. The first kind are what we refer to as subjective truths. And these are statements that are true relative to each individual. So for instance, if I say that ice cream is good, well then that's the kind of thing that is true for me. It's true dependent on what I happen to believe. If you don't like ice cream, then ice cream is good would be false relative to you. Again, take something like music. If you think that Miley Cyrus is a good singer, then that would be true relative to you. However, I don't like Miley Cyrus, so Miley Cyrus is a good singer would be false relative to me. All right, confession, I do think Wrecking Ball is a pretty good song, so that's just between us though. All right, so that's subjective truths. Subjective truths are the types of truths that would be true relative to each individual person. Now there's another kind of relative truth known as cultural truths. And these are going to be the types of truths that are true relative to a particular culture. So a good example of this would be driving on one side of the road as opposed to the other. If you live in the United States, for instance, it is correct to drive on the right side of the road. However, if you go to the UK, then that would be wrong. It is correct in the UK to drive on the left side of the road. And notice something important about relative truths. Subjective truths, you can believe and do whatever you want, and you can't be wrong. If I think ice cream is good, then I am right. And this statement would be true relative to me. However, cultural truths, you can actually be wrong. For instance, if I go to the UK and I start driving on the right side of the road, I can't say, hey, well, this is just what I want to do. I would actually be going against what society has said, and so I would be doing something wrong. So notice that even though some relative truths, such as cultural truths, they're not determined by objective facts in the world, you still can be wrong about cultural truths if you misunderstand what that culture has said to be right. Now, with all that being laid out, we can represent the two different kinds of truths in the following way. And we see here a chart in which we have objective truths, and these are the kinds of truths that are true independently what anyone thinks. Come down here and look at truths of math. 1 plus 1 equals 2. If you go around saying 1 plus 1 equals 5, you're just confused. You're wrong. Over here, though, we have relative truths, and these are the kinds of truths that depend either on the individual person, as with subjective truths, or they depend on the culture in which you live, or the culture in which it's been decided that something is correct or incorrect. Now, with this being laid out, we are presented with a good question. Where do moral truths lie in this chart? And when I refer to moral truths, I mean things like murder is wrong, theft is wrong, child abuse is wrong. And what someone who is a moral realist is going to say is that these go over here. Moral truths are objectively true. That moral truths such as murder is wrong, that's the kind of thing that's just true. And it is not dependent on what you happen to believe, nor is it even dependent on what your culture believes. Someone who is a moral realist believes that even some cultures as a whole could be wrong about what is morally right and morally wrong. Notice also here too that the moral realist is not saying that moral truths are scientific truths, nor are they saying that moral truths are historical truths. Rather, the claim is that moral truths such as murder is wrong or theft is wrong, that these are the kinds of things that are just wrong independently of what anyone or any particular culture happens to believe. Now let me summarize a few important features of moral realism. And one thing I want to say is that there are many, many versions of moral realism. There's not simply one particular kind. There are distinct versions. And something else that's important to highlight along these same lines is that realists disagree about a good many things. For instance, they disagree about things that are right or wrong. Some moral realists, for instance, will say something like, cheating on one's spouse, that's objectively wrong. Whereas others might say, no, cheating on one's spouse is morally permissible. All that you have to be in order to be a realist is to think that there are some. In fact, in order to be a moral realist, as long as you believe that one thing is universally right or one thing is universally wrong, then you would technically be a moral realist. Moral realists also disagree about why these things are wrong. So, for instance, some moral realists would say that things are wrong because they disobey or go against the will of God. That murder is wrong, and it's wrong for everybody because it goes against what God has deemed to be correct. Some people would say, no, that what makes murder wrong is that it fails to bring about the most happiness in the world. Others would say that what makes murder wrong is that it fails to show true respect to individual persons. So you can see here, hopefully, that realism is a very broad kind of theory. It encompasses a lot of different theories. Also, it's important to point out, as I have listed up here thirdly, is that realists do not say that universal or objective moral truths are necessarily universally believed. It's perfectly consistent with realism that something could be wrong and nobody be aware of it. So when you think about realism, think, for instance, about how we view, for instance, something like a scientific truth. The Earth is roughly spherical. Now, there was a time at which the majority of people thought the Earth was flat. But let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that at one time every single person thought the Earth was flat. Well, that wouldn't change the reality of things. Even if everybody thought the Earth was flat, it would still be round. Why? Because there's this objective truth about the shape of the Earth. And what realists want to say is that something very similar can be said for moral truths. What realists want to say is that some things, such as murder is wrong, or torture for pleasure is wrong, or it is wrong to punish innocent people, that these things are just wrong independently and regardless of what anyone happens to believe. Even if it turned out that everybody on the planet thought murder was perfectly acceptable, that wouldn't change the fact that it's still wrong. Why? Because murder is wrong, according to the realist, is an absolute truth. Finally, I want to point out that realists also can admit that there are gray areas in morality. Realists don't say that everything that's right or wrong is necessarily cut and dry. Sometimes it's not clear what is right and wrong. So don't think realists are necessarily committed to the idea that you have to always know what is right and wrong. All you have to do in order to be a realist is say that there's at least one thing that is universally and objectively wrong for everybody. Well, now that I've explained to you what moral realism is, I want to introduce a contrasting view called moral relativism. And what moral relativism says is that there are no objective moral truths. And I should have added this up here, but it should also say, and that moral truths are dependent on what people happen to believe. So there are really two theses when it comes to moral relativism. Number one, it denies the existence of objective moral truths. And number two, it says moral truths are true relative to human belief. Now, there are two different versions of moral relativism. And the first version is known as subjective moral relativism. And this consists of two doctrines. The first is there are no objective moral truths. And the second is moral truths are determined by each individual person. So if this doctrine is correct, then basically what it's saying is that every individual gets to make up their own system of morality. If you believe that murder is wrong, then murder is wrong for you, and that's all there is to say about morality. If I believe that murder is right, then murder is right for me, and that's all there is to say about morality. It's what each person believes is what goes. Now, as I was saying earlier, I don't think anybody can take this view terribly seriously. If this were the case, then we wouldn't hold serial killers in any kind of jeopardy. We wouldn't punish serial killers for their actions. If this were the case, we wouldn't hold rapists in contempt. We wouldn't punish child abusers. The reality is you don't get to make up your own system of morality. Sure, there are certain moral principles that you do get to adhere to that maybe I don't, but there are also some that we all are supposed to abide by. You're not supposed to murder people. That would be wrong. You shouldn't kidnap people and torture them. That would be wrong. You shouldn't steal from people. That would be wrong. So, subjective moral relativism is in truth not a theory that's taken terribly seriously. However, there's a second version of moral relativism that is taken much more seriously, and this is known as cultural moral relativism. And this consists of two theses also. And the first one says that there are no objective moral truths, and secondly, that moral truths are determined by what different cultures believe. So hopefully you can see that there's a significant difference between subjective and cultural moral relativism. And the difference is in terms of the second thesis that each one of these views holds. According to the subjective relativist, every individual person gets to make up their own system of morality. But however, according to cultural relativism, moral truths are determined and created by different cultures and what they happen to believe. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at a defense of cultural relativism by a very famous anthropologist named Ruth Benedict. And as you can see right here, Ruth Benedict, she lived quite a while ago. She was a professor at Columbia University. And she wrote a very influential work known as Patterns of Culture. And what's so interesting about this work is that she identifies societies where what is considered abnormal in our society is actually the cornerstone of another society. And by tracing these different societies and what they happen to believe, she comes to the conclusion that morality is just ultimately dependent and determined by each individual culture. And according to Ruth Benedict, what she believes at the end of the day is that morality reduces to and is really nothing more than just a kind of social norm. And remember earlier I had said that morality seems to differ from social customs and social norms. However, according to Ruth Benedict, that is not the case. The only difference between, for instance, something like don't drive on the right side of the road and murder is wrong, according to Benedict, the only difference between those is simply just that we get more worked up about something like murder than we do about driving on one side of the road as opposed to the other. But at the end of the day, both are nothing more than social conventions. I actually really like the way that Ruth Benedict put this. She says the following: morality differs in every society and is a convenient term for socially approved behaviors. And that's what morality is and nothing more, just socially approved behaviors. So according to the relativists, we can look back at this chart right here. And we can see that for the realist, moral truths went over here. However, for the relativist, that's not the case. For the relativist, moral truths are going to go over here. And for the cultural relativist in particular, someone like Ruth Benedict, moral truths are going to go right in here. Moral truths are just going to be a distinct kind of cultural truth and nothing more. Now, hopefully this doesn't insult your intelligence, but I just want to make sure that we're understanding the difference between realism and relativism. And so to be clear, what the realist is claiming is that there are some moral truths, and I'm just picking murder is wrong because I assume that we're all going to agree on this. But murder is wrong. They say, according to the realist, that this is wrong, and it's wrong independently of what anyone thinks. And according to the realist, what is going on is that murder is wrong applies universally to every distinct culture. So think of these different circles as representing distinct cultures. Maybe this one is the United States, and this one is Africa, and this one is Asia, this one is South America, I don't know, this is Australia, whatever. And what the realist is going to say is that murder is wrong. This is true, and it applies to everybody. Now, this isn't to say that everybody believes it. Maybe the purple people over here, they think that murder is good. But what the realist is going to say is they're just wrong. They're wrong because they should believe this because it applies to every single society. Now, cultural relativist is going to say something very, very different. And what the relativist is going to say is there is no universal truth. There are no universal moral truths. Let me be very clear. The relativist doesn't say there are no universal truths, period. Even the relativist is going to acknowledge that there are certain universal truths, like 1 + 1 = 2, or the shape of the earth, or historical facts. All the cultural relativist is saying is there are no universal moral truths. Don't ignore that word, moral truths. That's really important. And they're going to say all there is just what every society believes and what every society does. And that's all there is to morality. If this society right here thinks murder is wrong, then it's wrong for them. If this society thinks murder is okay, then it's okay for them. And so morality is going to be strictly created and determined by what each society thinks. Now, just to summarize a little bit of what we've been discussing, there are several important features of cultural relativism. And the first feature is that there are no objective moral truths. Number 2, we can say that the moral code of a society is determined by what that society deems correct or incorrect and nothing else. What makes murder wrong? Society has said that it's wrong. What makes murder permissible? That society has said it's permissible. That's all there is to it. Number 3, no culture's moral beliefs are objectively better than any other culture's moral beliefs. So if one society thinks that murder is wrong, and another society thinks that it's okay, that it's morally permissible, you cannot say that one is better than the other. They're just different ways of doing things and different beliefs. And you have to make a comparison here between other kinds of social norms, like driving on the right versus the left side of the road. You can't say that it is better to drive on the left or it's better to drive on the right. There's just simply what different societies do and nothing more. And for the cultural relativists, they want to argue that the same can be said when it comes to morality. Number 4, our culture's moral beliefs have no special status. They are just one amongst many. Sometimes we get the sense that all cultures are equal, but our culture happens to be just a little bit better. But according to the relativists, that's false. Our society's moral beliefs are no better than any other societies around the world. So our society's moral beliefs, they're no better than Germany's. They're no better than, for instance, ISIS or a terrorist organization. They're no better than those in China. They're no better than those in North Korea. There's just what different societies do, and that's all there is to it. One final thing I want to point out is according to the relativists, there is no such thing as objective moral progress. Now, a cultural relativist can admit that there is progress, but it's not really and truly what you might say as objective progress. There's only progress relative to that society's current views. So let me try to explain this a little bit more. And think about how we can talk about trends in fashion. Sometimes we'll say that things like, oh my goodness, look at the way people dressed in the 80s. That was so silly. And we have the idea that the way people dress now is somehow better than the way people dressed in the 80s. Or we'll laugh at the bell bottoms people wore back in the 70s. Or we'll laugh at haircuts that people had back in the 90s. And we'll think that the way that we dress or the way that we groom ourselves now is somehow better. Even though we think of it in this way, at deep down we know that there's no such thing as true, genuine progress in fashion. There are just different ways of dressing. And chances are, if you wait long enough, things that are unfashionable now will become fashionable again. That's just how it goes. Things come in cycles in fashion. But you wouldn't say there's true, genuine, objective progress. It's just things change, and people look back on the past and view what they do now as being somehow better, but it's not truly better. And what the cultural relativist is going to say is that the exact same thing holds for morality. For morality, there's no such thing as some things being truly better now than it was in the past. Things change. Now we happen to like those changes more. If you wait long enough, things will probably revert to the way they once were. And people, and when it changes again in the future, they'll probably view that change as somehow better. But the reality is no change is truly better. Changes in morality are just different. They're just different, and that's all there is to it.